Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another monk chat. This time with Bante Sudaso, Bante Sumino, and Bante Pamuto. So at this time, if you have any questions for one or all of us, you can type them in the live chat and we will address them in the order they come. So you're free to ask up to 2 questions just to start while everyone gets an opportunity. And then after that, you can ask as many questions as you like until 9 o'clock when we will break for the night. So welcome right now to Elaine, who really enjoyed Bante's talk last night, as well as Gita and Yana, and all our friends who are watching in the background. And Gita already has questions. So can you speak a bit about 1, taming the mind, 2, training the mind, and 3, transcending the mind?
Isn't that technically 3 questions?
Very clever.
Very clever.
And you've got, we could talk about anything in the Buddhist path and it would fall within those.
That is true, actually.
So we would have cast a net. Why don't we each take one?
Oh, good idea.
I don't know what 2 was, but I'll do 2.
Training the mind.
Okay. But somebody has to speak.
Oh, so number 1, taming the mind?
Are you saying I should do that one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
No, you didn't do transcending the mind, actually. You're good at that.
Okay.
So I guess I'll take number 1, taming the mind.
They always give me the hard question.
So taming the mind. So I guess it depends on what you mean by taming. The first thing that comes to mind actually is one of the suttas where the Buddha was meditating, and he realized that he could divide his thoughts into 2 categories: those that were unwholesome and led away from concentration, from stability of mind, from enlightenment, and those that were wholesome, so those that led towards skillful qualities, beneficial mind states, and to enlightenment. And so in that moment, he was like, well, why don't I abandon the unwholesome thoughts, the ones that aren't helping me, the ones that aren't beneficial? So when I think of taming the mind, I think of this sort of process of recognizing what's in the mind, just to begin with, the state of mind that you're in, recognizing if your thoughts are scattered, if they're tending towards aversion, if they're tending towards sensuality, and then letting go. So letting go of anger, letting go of this sort of wanting mind that's always searching for things here and there. Now, letting go sounds easy, but it's very difficult. And sometimes that involves cultivating what you might hear is called antidotes to the mind states that are coming up. But I think for taming the mind, it's sort of getting to that point where you can go, okay, this is what's there. And then now, what can I do about it? Which I think leads into training the mind.
As it turns out, one of my favorite themes in the Buddha's discourses, and it comes up a lot in the Majjhima Nikaya, though it's also like the backbone of the Digha Nikaya as well, is the gradual training, the Anupubbasika. And so for me, as soon as I read this, I'm like, oh, wow, this is what we do every time we go on a meditation retreat. And so training the mind is starting to gradually apply processes of refinement to our mental activities to bring out the later stages of the Noble Eightfold Path. So we're applying energy, efforts, we're developing mindfulness, and then we get samadhi. The mind becomes composed and wieldy, and we're able to direct it however we want. It's very skillful. And the Buddha said it's like somebody with a lathe. They've got the wood spinning on the lathe. They can make whatever shape they want at that point. And that's the mind, like when it's concentrated, you just pick a shape Like I want to do metta, I want to do uh, contemplation of the body. That's what you get when you train the mind. So to develop that, the gradual training starts with morality, so sila, and this is starting to adopt protocols and principles that kind of bracket your activities. So if I go too much to this extreme, it's indulgence. I go too much to this extreme, it's self-mortification. This way I get in trouble, this way I get in trouble, and you find the middle. And once you start getting good at that, your conduct leads to a peaceful mind state. Then you start refining it. You train your mind to practice sense restraint. So the mind that goes out, seeking beautiful things or recoils from unpleasant things, preceded by that is the mind just wandering unrestrained. So you start to be like, well, I don't have to restrain my mind. I can just experience all the different things that my mind interacts with. But then it will be turbulent whenever I'm around these objects. So you start refining the scope of your attention to be, within the bounds of things that don't cause you turbulence. And this is when you stop watching so much TV, and you stop wearing perfumes and cosmetics, and you start moderating how much food you eat and how much you sleep. You want to find a nice, even middle ground. Further on, it leads into mindfulness. So you start. It's twofold. One is you start becoming mindful of all the things you're doing throughout the day. So you establish a continuity of mindfulness. And the other plays in the other two. So morality and sense restraint have already given you a sense of what sorts of activities produce mindfulness and which ones don't. So you're refining to those activities where you can keep mindfulness because you want a continuity of mindfulness. And when this starts to arise, then you get there's usually some mopping up of just brightening the mind, and there's often later stages before samadhi that are like contentment. So you develop contentment with the necessities that you've got to sustain yourself. When you've got enough, you got enough, and you're just happy. You're like, I don't need anything else. Or you really you practice devotion to wakefulness in a very sustained way. So you start sleeping only what's necessary to rest the body. And these are things that work best on meditation retreat. So when you're reaching that level, your mind is, at least temporarily, thoroughly well trained. You're going to start getting in the door of concentration, a very deep samadhi, and you're going to be able to investigate phenomena really well. And then this will lead on to exploring transcendence.
Yeah, so transcending the mind. Briefly speaking, that's recognizing, first off, that all the objects of mind, so all the mental activities and thoughts and emotions, recognizing that all of them are impermanent, insubstantial, and impersonal. They're not who we are. They don't define us or control us. They're just things that pass through awareness. And then recognizing that beneath that, there's a more subtle layer of a surface or field in which those mental objects and activities appear, and recognizing that that mental surface is also impermanent, insubstantial, and impersonal. That's also not ultimately who we are. It's not what controls us or defines us. So in that way, we are aware of the mind and its objects and activities from a third person perspective, seeing it as not me, not mine. And therefore not something that affects us, not something that controls us, not something we need to worry about or be bothered by. So that's transcending the mind.
Great, thank you. Looks like a couple more friends have joined in. Okay, and then Kaylin asks, I've heard out of all the religions/philosophies, Buddhism relates to science the most. What in Buddhism is scientific? Please and thank you. So I'm usually of the mindset that we shouldn't compare sort of cross belief systems or across philosophies, because there's actually um, quite a few things that are just seen from a different perspective, whether it's Buddhism versus Hinduism or Buddhism and Christianity, and also Buddhism and science. So I don't know if I would say that Buddhism relates to science the most, but I would say that Buddhism does not, for the most part, contradict scientific discoveries, if you will, or scientific theories. So if, tomorrow we know that the sun is however many million degrees Celsius, well, Buddhism has no problem with that. If we see that the earth is round, again, there's no issue with that. Matter and physics and all of those things, they're not contradictory with Buddhism, because honestly, Buddhism doesn't care about those things. Buddhist practice is more concerned with subjective experience and how we can use our subjective experience to ultimately free us from suffering. And that suffering that we create with our minds and within our minds. So to the extent that, science can be helpful in helping us learn more about the physical world and also learn more about how this body works, how people behave, etc., then it can be complementary to Buddhism. But there's definitely sort of a point of departure where science is more concerned with physical matter, so to speak, whereas Buddhism is more concerned about spiritual endeavors. And for better or for worse, spiritual practice is something that is basically impossible to measure with an instrument. So, I mean, maybe one day scientists will discover, exactly what we need to do to enter jhana. But until then, it's very much going to be a subjective practice of trial and error. And so, yeah, to that extent, I would say, Buddhism doesn't deny science, but it also keeps its value in a very specific place. And ultimately, what's most valuable are the practices that will lead to the end of suffering.
What I would add to that, first off, that was all great. One thing I would add, something about Buddhism that is scientific, is the experimental mindset. The mindset of not automatically believing something, but rather experimenting and seeing what happens. Also, the idea of observation, of observing experience and trying to deduce truth from those observations. Those are things which are somewhat similar to the scientific method.
Okay, thank you. And then Robin asks, is there a distinction between types of meditation that aim only at building and maintaining concentration and other types that aim to use concentration to investigate some topic? Well, I went first last time, so.
Yes. Ultimately, it has to do with what you're trying to do with the meditation. So, for example, the 6 elements, you can use it either as a concentration method or as an insight method. Depends on what you're trying to do. So concentration is just about stabilizing the mind, collecting the mind, unifying the mind. So if that's all you're trying to do, that's all you'll get. Insight is about trying to identify the ways that we make ourselves suffer and trying to break those habits, trying to change the way we see the world so that we stop suffering. So that's insight. So an example of the 6 elements, for example, taking the earth element, concentration is just focusing on the solid feeling of the body and holding the mind steady on the solid feeling of the body. until the mind stops all other activities. Then you're practicing samadhi, concentration. But if you are recognizing that the solid elements of your body are exactly the same as the solid elements of the rest of the world, that it's all exactly the same elements, that there's no distinction between inside and outside, that none of it can be called me or mine because it's all just the naturally occurring elements, then even though you're doing the same activity of focusing on the earth element, it's a very different result because you're trying to break the habit of seeing some parts of the earth element as me. So in that sense, even though you're using the same meditation object, the intention is different, so the result is different.
Okay, great. All right. And then Mark asks, so in Buddhism, the awareness that watches our thoughts is called, ? Consciousness? And this is still part of interdependent origination? Am I saying this correctly?
Your turn.
Yeah. So there's a lot of crosstalk about this, even amongst monastics. There's no one simple answer. In one presentation, the Buddha gives dependent origination, and that ignorance conditions volitional formations. The volitional formations condition consciousness, and then on through dependent origination. Stan the cat is having some sort of difficulty over there.
Existential angst by the sounds of it.
Yeah.
In another presentation, the Buddha is talking more about sense consciousness, and he's saying that dependent on the eye seeing a form, you have the arising of consciousness. He says with the absence of either of those, consciousness does not arise. And that's one way he presents to get over suffering, actually, is to recognize that consciousness itself is impermanent. So we have different, even different uses of consciousness within the framework of Buddhism. So if one presentation works for you, then you should stick with that and come to understand it within its own scope. Don't try to get that consciousness to match the dependent origination consciousness. You might be able to through a lot of like mental contortion, but it's not what they're used for. The Buddha taught those at different times to different people for different circumstances. So if you get a framework, I really encourage you to stick with it. So now the sense of awareness is very interesting. And we were talking about this earlier in a sutta discussion, that even if you reach a level of concentration where all sense of perception of basically everything, the four elements, the world, the basis of infinite space and consciousness, even when you've ceased to attend to any of these, there is still percipience. It's just not percipient of any of those things. And the Buddha says, how do you arrive at that consciousness or that sense of awareness? Is by attending to nibbana, that element which is not conditioned. So if you got in there and you'd be like, what's he talking about? What kind of, what is that? Is it awareness? Is it consciousness? Is it sense conscious? It's, in that state, you're talking about something so subtle, like these distinctions don't even like apply. So there is a fundamental awareness in the mind that is capable of being aware of that which is not conditioned. And once things get that subtle, all of these word distinctions will fall away anyway. So we're using the sense of consciousness just to get us in the door, really. Like noticing how we're aware of things and noticing that awareness arises and ceases. And I think that's a really useful sense of consciousness. And as far as awareness, again, the scientific method, like if you get far enough to explore deeply into this, you're probably not going to be able to really explain what it is you're experiencing, except in terms of what you were paying attention to before it happened. So then you don't really need to have an exact answer, because you'll only be able to discuss it with other people who've had that same experience, and they'll know what you're talking about anyway.
Great. All right. Then Bhavani asks, Namaste, how to practice mindfulness in the kitchen? Because I'll have to do many things at a time, and also people will be disturbing me. Thank you. One thing, there's a monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, a really respected teacher who I also respect. And I remember that when he talks about meditation, mindfulness, and Buddhist philosophy, he always asks people to ask themselves. So, like in this question, for example, mindful of what? Because I think sometimes, mindfulness turns into like this buzzword that can lose its sort of meaning and its potency. And then it just becomes like some other thing that you should be doing or that you have to be doing. But when you ask mindful of what, then when you have to fill in the blank, it becomes, I think, a little more, it's like a prompt. It's to get you to stop and actually consider your situation. So in terms of how to practice mindfulness in the kitchen, well, it's not much different than practicing mindfulness in any other aspect of your life. It's what are you being mindful of? So most of the time, at least in Buddhist practice, we're being mindful of bodily sensations, for example, the breath or just how the body feels from the inside. Could be being mindful of your mind states. So are you agitated? Are you stressed? Are you peaceful? Are you happy, excited? So since you carry your body and your mind with you, basically anywhere you go, in the kitchen, it's a similar practice. If you're preparing a meal for a party of 20 people, then being mindful of your breath, being mindful of your body, your mind states could help you relax. But it's also important to know that we're not relaxing for the sake of relaxing per se. Mindfulness is more about just being aware of what's occurring in the present moment and recognizing if it's an opportunity for you to do something about it. So it's not just, being mindful that you're stressed and then, continuing to chop furiously and accidentally chopping off a finger, but, you're aware that your finger is bleeding, but you still have to finish the food. It's recognizing, okay, I'm stressed, for example. Maybe I need to slow down. Maybe I need to take a break. Maybe this is too much for me. So you mentioned that you have to do many things at a time. Well, do you have to do many things at a time? So again, it's like considering in every situation that you're in, what's happening, and then what's the appropriate response that I can take for the situation. And then if people are also disturbing you, well, being mindful doesn't mean that you just accept that people are disturbing you in whatever way that they're disturbing you. You can recognize if one, you're simply disturbed by someone's presence, in which case maybe there's something internal you have to do. But if people are constantly asking you for things and coming in and showing you videos on YouTube and telling you the cat needs to be fed and the lawn needs to be mowed, then maybe that's a time where you have to say, okay, hey, I'm trying to cook right now, and it would be really nice if you could ask me these things later. So mindfulness doesn't have to be this sort of esoteric, special thing that creates an aura or a glow around you while you're in the kitchen, but it's really just being present with what's happening, and accepting, the things that maybe can't be changed in the moment, but also recognizing that there's an element of action that you have, karma, if you will, where you can choose to alter your situation in ways that are beneficial, ways that are wholesome. So yeah, one concrete thing that you could do to practice mindfulness in the kitchen is just say, okay, what am I feeling right now? And if whatever the answer is, whether it's content, happy, stressed, angry, annoyed, then you make space for that and you allow that awareness to direct your action. So you're not just mindlessly building up anger and aversion, and also not ignoring this feeling of contentment if it's there, this feeling of happiness, or joy of cooking for others or even for yourself. So, great.
Let me just add a little bit. It occurred to me while you're speaking, Bhante, that it ties in very nicely to the talk of the gradual training. So as you're pointing out, like the buzzword is that mindfulness is this sort of like passive thing that we're, if we're mindful, like we've stopped all the other activity in our mind and we're just receiving the present moment. We're being here now, and try to do that while you're active. It's like mindfulness is actually a very active thing. It is involved with action, and it's not like the first step. In the gradual training, you've got stuff that comes before it. So you have the opportunity, if you want to be mindful in the kitchen, you've got to set the scene for that. Your conduct throughout the day and your approach to it, your sense of morality and ethics, but even just a sense of planning and like setting the scene as though you would for a meditation. And that's so if you want to be mindful in the kitchen, you've got to intend, okay, how could I cultivate mindfulness in this situation? What conditions will lead to that occurring? And then there are some that might support mindfulness, like having some chanting going in the background, or just like putting down the blinds so you're not distracted by something outside. Having a recipe can allow you to be very sequential. You can be, instead of doing 3 things at once, you have the recipe and it says, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And so you fully complete number 1 before you begin number 2. And then you don't get stressed about doing 3 things at once because it's just one chop at a time. And there are things that will distract you. So like having other people coming in and out, it doesn't work for sitting meditation. And that's where you're also trying to cultivate mindfulness. So why would it work in the kitchen? If you do get people on board with the idea like, hey, I want to make this meal and not get stressed in the process. Let's do this together. So you give me a bit of space and I'll give you some good food. And that's the way we do it here at the monastery. I give Bhante some space and they give me good food. It works out.
Yeah, similarly in Zen monasteries, they commonly say to treat the kitchen like the meditation hall. So that means, avoid unnecessary speech, unnecessary activity, focus on what you're doing, pay attention to what you're doing. Do one thing at a time. Don't try to do too many things at the same time. Keep it simple, and try to do everything in a peaceful, relaxed way. Okay, next one.
So John asks, I asked previously about the practice that led to becoming a Sotapanna. Bhante recommended Anatasanya practice. How should this be practiced in formal meditation?
Actually covered that. And that question came up.
We touched on
when
it.
The question was asked.
Actually, I recommend looking up the instructions I give for meditating on the 6 elements. There's been some recordings of that in the past. That's the main way I recommend practicing it. The other is practicing the perception of impermanence, which naturally leads to the perception of not self as well. And finally, another way is to look at somebody else's body and see how when you look at somebody else's body, there's a very clear sense, that's not my body. So notice the feeling in the mind. You look at that and you know that's not my body. So try to keep that same feeling as you turn attention to your own body. So it's like, that's not my body. This also is not my body. That's one way that you can practice, which can be quite potent. Those are the main ways I recommend. But experiment. The suttas give a quite bare framework. The suttas say to regard body and mind as this is not me, this is not mine, this is not myself. So figure it out. There's not a lot of hand holding there. But the methods I've just described are some more specific ways of practicing it. Okay.
If I could, like a real world example of this was in my wandering, I happened to be wandering in a region of Western Massachusetts that was home to a famous Roshi, Bernie Glassman Roshi, at the end of his life. And about a year or two before he passed away, he had a stroke, and it profoundly affected one side of his body. I think it was the right side. And but he had, years and years of meditation practice. He's a teacher of like hundreds of students, many of whom are their own teachers and leaders of communities. So he had done a lot of work in letting go, in a sense of not self. And he was sitting down and talking with him, and he was relating this experience he had of, because some of the perception of the one side of his body had been messed up and diluted. He, at one point, he had his hand on the table, and his wife Eve had put her hands on the table next to him, and he was looking down at the hands, and for a minute he didn't know which one was his. There was some dissonance there, and it was a very vivid experience for him, because we're just used to having a real concrete sense of this is me and this is mine. But when he saw that, he didn't know, he couldn't tell, like the sense of control was also gone. So it's like, if he thought, move the hand, which hand is going to move? And so also in the Anatta Sutta, the Buddha describes the experience of, if form were us, then we could say, may my form be thus, may it not be thus. And so one way I look at this is just notice those things that I don't have control over. And then as Bhante says, like just building on that. So you start on one thing that, it is obviously not under your control. And if you're sick, you usually see a lot of things. You can't tell your nose to stop running. And it's going to just keep running. And you could spend a lot of time suffering over that. Or you can be like, oh, wow, I don't have any control over this. Like, oh, I guess I don't have any control over the saliva in my mouth. Not really. Earwax or, any of it. And that actually is the water element meditation in a nutshell.
Right. All right. Oops. Okay. Jens asks, please excuse the fashion question. I know some monks, especially true, especially those in Thailand, shave their eyebrows. Do you know the origin of this practice?
We do. It's funny.
Yeah. Well, for one thing, you might notice that none of us shave our eyebrows. Look, big fuzzy caterpillars up here.
I wanted to. If you shave them and then they start growing back like thicker, and at one point like a strong wind would cause them to like poke me in the eye. So everybody else would be out looking, oh, isn't this wind great? And I'd be like, So I really wanted to shave them, but I've resorted to just kind of like trimming them. I'm like, okay, this will get under control at some point.
Yeah, one thing I noticed when I started letting my eyebrows grow back in is you can see your own eyebrows. I never realized this before I was a monk, but you can actually see them. Like if you look up, you can see the hair hanging over your eye. Anyway, as to why it's done, the story that I've heard is that a little over 100 years ago, there was a war between Burma and Thailand. Burma and Thailand share a very long border, and there's lots and lots of ways to cross over that border. And it's also quite normal at the time for monks to travel between different monasteries. So there were spies from both countries, spies pretending to be Buddhist monks, who would sneak over the border and then hide out in the other country and spy and send back reports. So one day, in order to root out the spies, the Burmese spies in Thailand, the Thai government just suddenly out of the blue ordered that every monk in the country had to shave their eyebrows. Then they had their own spies back in Burma watching for anybody who came over the border with shaved eyebrows. So this was a way that they were able to find out who the Burmese spies pretending to be monks were. And the law was just never repealed. It was kept. And it became a standard tradition in Thai monastic Buddhism, even though it was only relevant for a very short period of time. It just never went out of common usage. That's the story I heard anyway.
And there's a lot of stuff like this in Buddhism. It's like applicable at a time, and people just stick with it. It's like, that's the way my teacher did it. I don't see any reason not to.
Great. Then Kaylin asks, what's the difference between the soul and the spirit? I don't know, which is great because I don't need to know in order to practice Buddhism. So you might be aware of the teaching of not self, which actually can also be translated, I've seen translated as not soul or no soul. So in Buddhist practice anyway, there is not this belief that there is sort of this essence, enduring essence that we have that a lot of different traditions call the soul, something that's who we really are inside of us. My understanding when I've heard people talk about the spirit and the soul is that they're the same. But again, these people are usually speaking about different spiritual practices. So depending on which practice it is, they may be talking about different things. In Christianity, for example, there is a difference between the soul and the spirit. The soul being this personal soul that people have, and the spirit belonging only to the Trinity, God, the Holy Spirit, or the Holy Ghost, and Jesus Christ. But again, that's outside the realm of Buddhism. So unfortunately, I don't have much to say about it.
Yeah.
All right. And then Elaine asks, what do you think of wearing a Buddhist amulet? Is there any benefit to it?
Potentially, yeah. Well, first off, just from a strictly psychological standpoint, if wearing the amulet reminds you that you're Buddhist, and reminds you to practice Buddhism, reminds you to cultivate wholesome qualities, then that's beneficial. If it gives you a sense of connection to Buddhist tradition, then that's beneficial. Can there be amulets which have actual metaphysical power? Yes. Can that help you attain enlightenment? I doubt it. Again, as far as I can tell, the primary value of Buddhist amulets is that they remind you to practice well. They remind you to train your mind. I'm not sure there's any inherent salvific power to amulets, or else the Buddha would have talked about it. There would be the Amulet Sutta, which would speak about when to harvest the hair clippings and nail trimmings and how to make them into amulets and so on. But there's nowhere do we find any teaching where the Buddha talks about making amulets or how amulets can help you attain enlightenment. So as far as I can tell, their primary function would be symbolic rather than metaphysical. So again, there might be metaphysical power, it just wouldn't have anything to do with enlightenment.
Okay. All right, and then Elijah asks, or says actually, greetings, Venerable Pamuto. It's Elijah from Temple.
Elijah from Temple. What are you doing online, Elijah? But it's nice to see you.
Well, great to see you in robes, Three Bows. Hope to make my way to New Jersey to see you in the Sangha sometime.
I look forward to that.
I take it this is someone you know.
Yeah, somebody at Temple Monastery.
Okay.
And hope meditation is going well.
Well, I'm happy to hear that at Temple Monastery, you're allowed to watch live streams of other monasteries.
It's good for you. Like, I mean, get as much Dhamma as you can get.
Yeah.
Yeah, cross-pollinate. Cross-pollination is healthy. Yep.
You just coined a term that's going to saturate my whole concept of American Buddhism.
Okay, and then Bhavani asks, I would like to know about your teachers, their names, and how strict they were with you, how they trained you, etc. Also, how is Aya? I'm missing her.
Well, Aya's on personal retreat, by the way. So that's why she's not around, is we're giving her the opportunity to be as secluded as she wants and not have to worry about anything. So she has a week to just do her own thing in privacy.
She's having a great.
Yes. As for your previous question, that could be a very long and detailed answer. So instead, I'm going to give an extremely short and undetailed answer. First off, I don't really identify anyone as my teacher, but rather I say that I have had many teachers over the years. But if people force me to pick a single name, then I pick my preceptor. So my preceptor is Ajahn Pasanno. How strict was he with me? Actually, not terribly strict, but that's because I'm a hate type. And if you're too strict with hate types, it just makes them worse. So you're supposed to be gentle with hate types so that they start to learn gentleness. So he was pretty gentle with me for the most part, actually. That's it.
Well, Bhante Sadasa is my preceptor. But similarly, I've learned a lot from many different teachers, so naming them would take a long time. I don't necessarily respond well to strictness, and so I've never. I've met a couple teachers actually who have been known to be really strict with their students, but I've never perceived that, and I think that's just partially because I'm relatively self-motivated and respond to sort of the first admonishment, if you will.
The shadow of the whip.
Yeah, the shadow of the whip. So I usually don't have to feel the whip in order to act.
Just for the record, that's metaphorical. So
no, they read suttas. They got it. They know it came from the Sutta of the Thorough.
So there's some people here who have probably not read that sutta. So just to be clear, we don't actually.
This is the Theravada. We keep it real.
We don't actually whip people. Okay,
it's rough and gritty.
There's no whips involved. It's a metaphor.
Yes, it's in one of the suttas where the Buddha is asked how he trains his disciples, and he uses a metaphor that's similar to how horse trainers train horses. So no whipping.
Dear Lord,
actually.
I can hear the rumors starting already.
Don't fear it. It goes both ways. Some people are like, yeah, that's what I need. I'm signing up.
So actually, that's a good point. There are some people who do need strictness and who respond to strictness, actually. People who, if you were too kind of loosey-goosey, gentle, and to sort of tiptoey around them, they wouldn't understand, they wouldn't get it. So I think the best teachers actually know what their students respond to. So they use strictness in a way that helps the students rather than crushes them, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just repeating what the two venerables said, we're very fortunate to have access to many teachers. And I've sort of cultivated this through my time as a monastic, which is really my whole time practicing Buddhism. I pretty much jumped at the opportunity when I realized it was possible. But when there's somebody who's in a position, any sort of teacher or mentor role, I usually look and I say, this person by this point is probably doing something really well, or they would already have dropped out of the monastic order. So I start but though this applies not just to monastics, like there's lay teachers where I've been like, I really want to study this, from this person, and I usually look for that thing, and it comes, and I just get this aha moment, and it's like, oh wow, they've got ready access to their humor, like they're not taking things so seriously, or they're very disciplined and orderly and balanced, or they're very clever and understand um, the essence of the teaching very quickly, and they turn things upright. And when I notice this about a teacher, I take the perspective of like a martial artist, and I say, okay, I'm going to train myself in that. I'm going to study everything this person does, and I'm going to recreate the environment by which they learned this particular skill, and I'm gonna apply that, and I'm going to learn it too. And so I've had a bunch of people that I've done this with, and I consider them all my teachers. And at one point, I had pictures of them all because I was off in the woods, and I would just set up the pictures, and I'd be like, sort of like recollecting the Buddha. It would help me remember all of these qualities that I had cultivated over my time as a monastic. So some of the teachers were fairly disciplined, but I'm a delusion type. So if you're familiar with the character types, you know that you could whip a delusion type. You're not necessarily going to get the result you want. They were pretty thick-headed. So most of my teachers, the ones that really shaped my practice, the way in was through a sense of trust. So they first established a rapport, and it's usually a sense of mutual respect. Like they started from a point where they could see that I was trying, and they saw that I was trying. They started to give me like little bits. It's like, oh, okay, you want to learn this? Well, then try this. This is what I did, and they would teach me stories. And at different points, once this had progressed, then they could be quite forceful. They're like, okay, if you don't cut off this particular mind state, you're not going to get what I found. And it would really, like, there would be some meditations where I just sit there and I'd be like, I've got to cut this off. I've got to stop doing this. This is, no, can't ever tell a lie. Just give it up. Like, don't leave any corner for this to get in there. Just say no. Or I'd be like, no, I won't go back and forth on an issue. I see my mind wanting to be a little of this and a little of that. And I'm like, no, I'm going to choose. I'm just going to take a stand on something. And because of the faith in the teacher, I provided the crucial element of discipline. So I think you'll find the best teachers bring it out of you, not just being severe, just to keep you in line. Because the reality is, even the Buddha didn't do that. There's one wonderful sutta where Ananda has been really like just slacking off and doing all sorts of stuff, and he really should be training. And the Buddha starts to give him an encouragement to, go out and practice. And there's a subtext that Ananda was probably getting kind of like, this again. It doesn't say so much in the sutta, but the tone that the Buddha's speaking kind of changes a little. And at one point, the Buddha says, Ananda, I won't grab you and mold you like the potter does the clay. It's by repeatedly restraining you that I will teach you. And a good teacher will do this. They will repeatedly restrain our unwholesome tendencies. But in terms of the wholesome ones, they know that has to come from within. So they're kind of like the irrigator that channels the waters. They keep you from getting too far outside the bounds, and then they leave it up to you to bring forth the real energy for practice.
Then Liz asks,
You skipped one.
Oh yes, Sri Lanka. What is Bavanga?
So this is a term that comes from the Abhidhamma commentaries. So it's not actually in the Abhidhamma Pitaka. It's in the Abhidhamma commentaries. Bavanga literally means the existence factor. And the way it's defined in Abhidhamma commentaries is that any moment in which the mind is not doing anything particular except existing is called a Bavanga moment. It's kind of like the holding pattern of the mind. The mind is not engaged in any particular activity, it's just persisting. That's it. That's called a Bavanga moment. Sometimes called resting consciousness or the resting state of the mind. Anyway, so it's not talked about in the suttas, it's not talked about in the Abhidhamma. It appears over 1,000 years after the Buddha's death in some apocryphal literature, which built this whole complicated system of trying to break down mental functioning into excruciating detail for who knows what reason. That's where you find the term Bavanga appearing. So I've studied Abhidhamma a little bit, and I studied the Abhidhamma commentaries a little bit, and I was not impressed. Not impressed. The suttas are 1,000,000 times better.
All right.
I agree. Suttas are 1,000 times better. What did you say?
Only 1,000?
100 million times better.
Then Liz asked, frequently mentioned in New Agey circles is how, through essentially wholesome thoughts and actions, your physical vibration is raised. Thoughts on this, and are there any teachings alluding to it?
Good vibes. They're for real. Cultivate. It spreads out from you like ripples in a pond. Like that's the idea of interconnectedness. Like there's this idea that Theravada is like the selfish path, that you're just going to cultivate just yourself. You're going to get you some enlightenment, and you'll do it by just like forget all of you. It's like I'm going to get free, but you can't. The more you look at it, you realize that the thoughts going through your head are not yours, and you can't walk down a street without communicating with people. It's happening like through body language, subconsciously. Like there's so much exchange of information. So yeah, I mean, vibes are just just a way of talking about it. But the reality is, you're talking about interconnectedness, talking about the idea that if you've got a wholesome intention, it has to create a good result. It may not be the result you expect, and it may not come when you expect it, but it's out there. And many times that good result is so pervasive that you don't even notice it. You hold a door for somebody and it improves their whole day, but you're not there to see it. So it seems like a minor thing.
Yeah. Additionally, I would say that you can just sense actually when someone has cultivated a lot of kindness, compassion. They sort of give off this aura, if you will. And animals can sense it actually very easily. So animals have this very fine-tuned way of sensing when someone's a threat, and also when someone's not a threat. And I actually could observe this among different animals. So like we have chickens at the monastery. And there's also like squirrels in the garden, chipmunks, groundhogs, all these animals. And when the chickens are like running around, even though they're gigantic compared to squirrels and chipmunks, they're just kind of like, just another like harmless vegetarian. Well, omnivore, but non-threatening omnivore. And you can get this sense of safety from chickens if you're a mammal, at least, and not an insect. And it's similar with people, where you can sense just being around other people, whether they're someone that you can be safe around, but also you can sense when someone's stressed, when someone's angry, when someone's not doing too well. And so I guess, yeah, like Bhante said, physical vibration is just a label that's alluding to this sense that we can feel. But sense is real, or the um, effect it has is real.
So I would suggest that it's not physical at all.
Mm.
Rather, I would suggest that the field of consciousness, the domain of the mind, has no edges and boundaries to it. So just as the physical domain has no edges and boundaries, also the mental domain has no edges and boundaries. So yeah, you can feel another person's mind using your own mind.
Okay. And then Maitreya T asks, is there a sutta which describes step by step to how to practice loving kindness meditation, like the 16-step breathing meditation?
Don't think so.
Um,
Not in as much detail as the 16-step breath meditation, anyway.
No, that's
Okay.
part of why we chant the Karaniya Metta Sutta, is because it's kind of a blueprint. It describes both the qualities of somebody who's practicing metta and the mind states of that person. How they envision, like including everybody in their metta. But the thing about metta is it's not totally like linear. But one could say that the reflection on universal well-being, which is the English translation, the Metta Paranang, the Brahma Vihara Paranang.
Oh, I don't remember.
Yeah, but it's just that is the basis for like the whole teaching of starting with yourself and then others. And it's may I be well, may I be free from ill will, free from anxiety and such, and then may others be well, may they be free from anxiety. So this is applying to all the Brahma Viharas, but that's kind of like the one I can think of that sounds more like you say this, and then you say this, and then you say this.
There's also the directional one. So dividing the world into 4 directions. So in front of you, behind you, to your left and to your right. So it's may every being in front of me be happy. May every being to my left be happy. May every being to my right be happy. So that's another way that we see in the suttas. But yeah, nothing to the level of detail of the 16-step breathing meditation. And I think that's quite natural, actually, because metta is very simple. Metta is not complicated. It's just the feeling of universal benevolence. That's it. You actually don't need step-by-step instructions. You can produce metta directly. You don't need step-by-step. The step-by-step is just to help you get started. Okay?
Did anybody else feel a lot of metta when they saw Bhante going, may you all be happy. May you all be happy. You can't put that into a formula.
It's true. All right. And then Sri Lanka says, how can one deal with colleagues who are often angry and stressed and come to relieve it? Sure. I'll take this one. Well, to start anyway. Yeah, I've had a lot of experience actually being around angry coworkers or stressed coworkers. And actually, one of the things that helped the most that I found during Buddhist practice actually was practicing compassion. So metta or loving kindness meditation gets a lot of press, like they're like the celebrity of the Brahma Viharas. Everyone writes about them and talks about them. But I found that in a lot of cases, the other Brahma Viharas are very useful. And in this case, at least, dealing with other people who are just sort of caught in their own suffering, compassion as the first step was very helpful. So compassion is recognizing that there's a being suffering and wishing for that being to not suffer. And that for me kind of took the sting out of it. So oftentimes when we're around angry and stressed out people, there's this feeling of like, why do I need to be around this person? Why do I have to be in this situation? why can't that person just be happy and peaceful? And there's a lot of I in there. Like I should be, you know, in my peaceful and happy zone, and they're ruining it. But I found that with compassion meditation, I flipped that sort of script around. Instead of like worrying about me and what I was going through, and I wasn't the one who was angry or stressed, it was like, oh, wait a minute, there's people around me who are really suffering right now. And that sucks. And that's really hard. And I wish that they, could overcome that they would be free from suffering. So as a first step, that sort of like takes out this like annoyance or agitation that we get being around those kind of people, or those people who are experiencing these mind states. And then from there, the other Brahmavihara that comes in handy is equanimity. So recognizing that just as our thoughts, feelings, emotions are not ourself, clearly other people's thoughts, feelings, and emotions are not ourself either. So we don't have control over how other people feel and how other people experience the world. So on one hand, there isn't anything we can do to make someone not be angry. There isn't anything we can do to make someone not be stressed. What we can do, going back to compassion, is be there for that person and really try to understand their situation. Now, colleagues are in sort of an interesting category because they're not quite friends, but they're not quite strangers. And so there's this sense of sometimes separation that there is. And so it's up to you to kind of see what your relationship is like with these people. And just look for moments where you can make a difference, possibly, in helping to relieve that person's stress or anger. Whether it's helping them with a task or just asking them something that kind of takes their mind off whatever is stressing them out. So if they're really stressed about a project, be like, oh, what are your plans for the weekend? Like something that kind of like snaps them out of the moment that they're in. And then from there, if you develop a relationship with this person, you practice Buddhism. I've seen you in a lot of these live chats. Maybe you can talk to them about it, not in a proselytizing, sort of annoying, like you should be mindful way, but just, oh, every morning I've like taken 5 minutes to just relax. And maybe that's something that could be useful to them. So it's important not to fall into this aversive, like, oh, why does everyone around me like suck? Like if everything was perfect, then I'd be really happy. But rather thinking, there's people around me who could use some help. Am I able to help? And in what ways can I help? And then usually that's the best way to sort of deal with being in that situation and also relieving it. But ultimately also recognizing your own limits. So not, being the savior who's going to suddenly transform the workplace. Sorry to say, but a lot of workplaces are just built for misery. And there isn't really much that you can do to change it. But if you can help by just being there for other people, then I think that already does a lot for people who oftentimes feel like nobody cares about them, which is at least my experience in a 9-to-5 environment.
Okay.
Yeah. There's an aspect of equanimity, which is that it's not apathy. So when you're in a situation, you find yourself saying, I'm in this situation for a reason. It's not random that you're in this situation. That's what karma is like. There's conditions that mean you're being exposed to this, and a lot of times we find ourselves around somebody angry. There have been choices along the way that have gotten us there next to this person, and it's the same in our work situation. And it just since you are here, you are listening to some Buddhist monks talking, you probably have some Buddhist practice, or at least curious. I learn all sorts of things here. So there's this idea maybe starting to enter into the mind stream that the job is not the source of your happiness. And this is something different from the world. In the world, people identify very closely with their job, and they need their job to be successful and fulfilling and to sustain them and their family. There's a lot of clinging and need. Once you start to develop the path, you start to realize this path is outside the framework of the world. Like you're developing a sense of happiness and contentedness and fulfillment that is not dependent on your external situations. So bringing that into the workplace um, is incredible. Like to like what is beyond what you do, and you've some good suggestions. Like what is your viewpoint? What is your mental framework? Well, you're going in and you're going to experience what you're going to experience, but this is not what's going to make you happy. So you're going to do what you can to practice the path in this environment. There's no break in continuity of your practice. And so I was in the working world over the last year, and I mean it wasn't easy, and there was disagreement and strife and strange um, uh, instructions would sometimes arise, and the employees would have to be like, okay, are we understanding this right? No, or maybe we're not understanding this. Like we can't not do it, so we've got to figure out a way to make it work. um, and often, just at the end of a challenge, the other coworkers would be like, "Oh, this guy, he's like always calm," and I'd be like, "Really? That's how it looks." Like I was seriously challenged as well, but I guess it's just that difference of viewpoint. And it's just like you've got a little bit of equanimity goes a long way, and this applies not just in the workforce, but in the kitchen or in the monastery, in basically any environment you're in. If you have the right perspective, then you accept the challenges and you try to do the best you can with them. And then if you screw up, you just like, I tried. Well, it's impermanent, so I'll get another shot. And samsara it comes back around, and you get another shot, and maybe you've learned and you do better.
Great. All right, Maitreya T asks, how to practice lying down, I'm guessing, meditation. Is it described in the suttas?
Well, the posture is described. So, I mean, you can use any meditation practice while reclining. But the posture that's recommended in the suttas is lying on your right side with your feet on top of each other. That's it. I would demonstrate, but that's not the best for this setup. If you look online, I'm sure you can find instructions somewhere.
And you can also Google reclining Buddha statue.
Though the reclining Buddha has him resting his head, which is not actually good for meditation. It's not good for anything except causing severe pain in your arm
and neck.
Yeah.
Okay. So I was pretty sick for a while. So by necessity, I realized I can cultivate this posture, or I can lose hours and hours of my day because I just don't have the energy to sit, or it's just too painful. So there's the Theravada approach, and the way the Buddha taught using the lying down posture is that it's just like we were talking about the kitchen. You're setting up the conditions so that this time that you're lying down is going to be mindful. Now, your consciousness may arise and cease. You may not be there for the entire experience, but you've set the conditions for mindfulness. And you've even set the conditions for getting up. You're like, this is just the rest of the body. All I have to do is lay down, the body relaxes, my energy comes back up, and I get up and go back to practice. So that's the canonical approach, is that you decide that you set up mindfulness, you lay down, you set up the time, like this is when I'm going to get up, and then you just get right up, because there's no clinging to the lying down posture. And if you do it right, you're lying on the ground or a very simple mattress close to the ground. It's not that comfortable anyway. it's very easy to just be like, well, okay, okay, I'm rested. I'll just get up and get back to meditation. But I can say from my own experience, something that was very helpful is looking up yoga nidra. I think there's Roger Miller or Robert Miller or something like that had some nice like guided meditations and I really appreciated the way he walked through it. And I don't know if this is copyright infringement or whatever, but after I had heard it 3 times, I got an MP3 player and I recorded my own. So my own voice walking through a slightly different form of body scanning. And that's what I started to use. And after I had done this for 5, 6, 7 sessions, it was memorized. And so that at any time I was like lying down and I realized I wasn't immediately about to fall asleep, I would start playing that in my head right from the beginning, like, welcome to the practice of yoga nidra. And it sounds funny, but it would be like flipping a switch. And the body and mind would be like, oh, we know what to do. It's go time. And then it would lead to a meditation that was when it's done right, it's about developing equanimity and imperturbability. So you're getting to a posture where you know you will not injure yourself, and then you are not moving. So just like a good sitting position. And so that's why I recommend Yoga Nidra to look at, just to get the basis. Like, what does it sound like if somebody's guiding you through it? And then make your own. And because you're going to be laying down to sleep for the rest of your life, you might as well invest a little bit, make it your own.
Okay, then Elaine asks, how will I know if the amulet has metaphysical powers, or can I induce them into the amulet?
Next question. Yeah, the Buddha didn't talk about these things because, once again, it has nothing to do with attaining awakening. So if you want to learn how to put metaphysical powers into an amulet, just go on Google and type in, how can I put metaphysical powers into an amulet? You'll get, what? Yeah, it works. You'll find lots of websites about how to charge amulets with all kinds of powers and things. It just doesn't have anything to do with Buddhism. Yeah. No.
But yes, I will tell Aya Soma that you send your love and best regards.
Yeah.
Then Robin asks, what do the words holy and blessed mean in Buddhism, as in the holy life and the blessed one?
Well, holy life is a translation of brahmacharya. So Brahma means divine. So like the most heavenly celestial beings. And charya means behavior or conduct. So brahmacharya means behaving like a divine being. And in particular, what that's commonly referring to is the fact that divine beings, one, have no interest in sexuality, and two, their minds are filled with loving kindness, compassion, joyfulness, and equanimity. So then practicing brahmacharya means to be disinterested in sexuality and to have a mind which is filled with loving kindness, compassion, joyfulness, and equanimity. So translating that as holy is, it's okay. It's kind of a relic of the early days of translating things into English, where there was this impetus to try to use familiar religious terms for everything. But sometimes that winds up giving somewhat awkward, unintended consequences. Similarly with the Blessed One. Blessed One is a common translation of the word Bhagava. Bhagava more accurately means prosperous. So Bhaga is like a unit of wealth or possessions or property. And the suffix va or vant means one who possesses it. So Bhagava means one who has a lot of valuable stuff, one who is prosperous, who has a lot of what's important, a lot of what's valuable. And so in this case, that's used to describe the Buddha, because the Buddha has a lot of spiritual perfection. He has a lot of wisdom and compassion. And that's the most valuable possession of all. So he's the Bhagavad because he has the best possessions, which are wisdom and compassion. So the Blessed One is actually a very weird translation of Bhagava, but it's become so ubiquitous that maybe I'll start translating it as the prosperous one.
Do it.
Start a new wave. Yeah.
Okay. Then Bhavani asks, is it easy to meditate in the forest with wild animals around or in the monastery? Which one is the best experience? My pet cat Sangha Mitra doesn't like me sleeping while sitting.
I have a lot of experience with meditating in the forest.
It's hard. Stuff falls on you. There's ants, there's mosquitoes. I mean, just try to find flat ground in the forest. I'll give you a hint. It doesn't exist. Like the forest is built up, a tree falls and like dirt comes on the sides and water runs off it. Like it's just the ground is like, you do the best you can. A lot of it is just sitting and getting yourself within tolerances. So if there's just like 1 or 2 mosquitoes, you can kind of just shrug it off. But if there's 10 mosquitoes, I mean, realistically, how much blood can you lose? I imagine if there's enough mosquitoes, you just like pass out. So that's no good. Then you need some sort of protection, bug spray or a net. It's a lot easier in the monastery where you can kind of control it. And that's, you have a Dhamma hall, you have a place you can go to, a meditation room. You've basically cultivated a safe place to be able to just go straight to meditation. The one thing that can be said about being in nature is those wild animals, I mean, are not that wild. They're just other sentient beings, and they're very interesting. And when you're out there in the woods and you're being calm and still, you're as much a part of the environment as a tree. You get to see the lives of these creatures. You know, understand that they've got like social lives and they're interacting in interesting ways. You get to understand their calls and what they're telling each other. You become part of the force. And it's say if you want to learn about how to be natural, then you go into nature, because the squirrel is always got squirrel nature, probably Buddha nature too, but mostly squirrel nature as you watch it, and the fox, and even the spiders. Like you watch these little daddy long legs, and then they get to the other little daddy, and they go, and they get like battle posture, and you're like 100 times their size, and you're just watching this, and it's like, wow, that's some size. It can be very, very powerful. Whereas when you're in the meditation hall, it's more theoretical. Like, yeah, once I was suffering, like this pain in my knees is not life or death. But you see these 2 little daddy long legs. One of them's about to bite off the other's legs, and you're like, yeah, I've been there
too. Yeah. I've had some experience meditating in the forest, but even just being generally outdoors, I found that it's actually a good reminder that human beings are also animals in a sense. Human beings are also sentient beings, and we're subject to the same things that animals are subject to. So it's very easy, sort of in a sheltered or manufactured environment, to forget these things. But even just walking around here, the monastery is in a suburb of New Jersey, but you can see sort of beings dying actually quite frequently, more frequently than I imagined. And also you can see how difficult it is actually to survive by observing like the different animals, how they're constantly searching for food, constantly aware of every danger that's around them. And so for me, it's like a good reminder actually that a human being is not much different, actually. We need food. We're susceptible to danger on every corner. We just ignore most of them. And that also we're susceptible to dying and death, and sometimes unexpectedly, most times unexpectedly, um, and sometimes in some horrific ways. But then it's also good for building equanimity. So being outside, like Bante said, like things are crawling all over you. Like it's impossible to avoid, whether you have bug spray that keeps away the flying insects, but then there's the crawling insects, and it's incessant. But then you start to learn to tap into the piece that's within, where the crawling spiders and ants and stuff doesn't affect you as much. Know your limits, obviously, but eventually you come to find that you can meditate when it's windy, when it's a little rainy, when there's bugs, when it's hot. And I found that actually makes meditating indoors so much like better, because then you sit down and it's like, bam, there's air conditioning, there's no bugs, it's perfect. So it can help build your sort of endurance if you approach it in the right way. So Maitreya asks, do we need to practice all the 16 steps of mindfulness meditation in one sitting? I'm a beginner. I think I only managed to do till step 8 based on last night's Sutta study. You guys have fun.
Yeah, step 8 is pretty darn good for a beginner. Realistically, even just getting to step 3 is pretty darn good for a beginner. So I would actually say focus on the first 4 steps for a while until you've got that down pretty solid, and then start slowly introducing more and more steps. But don't try to push through the whole thing too quickly, or else you might get discouraged. The 16-step mindfulness of breathing meditation, it starts off simple, but it very quickly becomes very advanced. So it's fine to get some familiarity with the 16 steps, but recognize that if you don't have the first few steps down solid, then the later ones are not going to be terribly effective, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, even like there was the question earlier of like, how do you know to move on to the next step? Often you start to, it starts to arise on its own. It's like introducing itself. You're staying with the breath. The first 2 steps, and suddenly your mind is not following the breath anymore, and your sense of the body, you're just aware of a bit more, and then a bit more, and then that's the point where the mind says, okay, it would be safe to start applying myself to this. I wouldn't lose the mindfulness I've already developed. And then you start, okay, then I train myself. I'm training myself to keep the mindfulness of breathing while expanding the sense of the body. And especially once piti and sukha start to arise, it's like you can't make it happen. You can't be like, okay, I've done step 3. Step 4 sounds nice, but step 5 and 6 sound nicer. No, you can't. You stick with the 3rd step until the body starts to become fully known and tranquil. And as it starts to become fully known and tranquil, you start to get a sense that this is really joyful. This is fantastic, And it's just, you have to feel out. There's some point when you realize you can switch over to doing that, and you won't lose what's come before. That's when you're on that next step.
Okay. I would just add also briefly that it's important to not view the 16 steps as like a checklist. Like, check 1, I did number 1 for 5 minutes, check 2, 5 minutes. Like, you're not trying to cram all of them into an hour sitting meditation, dividing each step into its allotted time. Ajahn Brahm, for example, when he spoke about in one of his books, getting into deep concentration, he recommends not moving from sort of the first step until you've completely and fully mastered it. And that could mean that for the first step, which is being fully aware of your in-breath and out-breath, that it will take you months actually to master, because you have to pay attention. Well, are you just saying in-breath, out-breath? What am I eating for dinner? What's going on? oh, my breath, my breath. Like, is that if that's your whole meditation, then it's squandered. Your mind's all over the place. But are you actually following each breath fully and completely uninterrupted? And so once you sort of have that stability, then you'll sort of know when it's time to move on to the next step or not. Okay, we have a couple coming in. So Zen answers. Elaine Saunders says she's afraid that Mara would come if she tried to infuse her amulet with powers.
Yeah, just stick to Buddhism. But if you want to infuse it with something, one thing you can do actually is to pick a bodhisattva, and Guanyin is the safe one for this, by the way. But actually, any bodhisattva is fine. Any bodhisattva or any Buddha, hold the amulet, visualize that Buddha and or bodhisattva, and chant their name, or chant their mantra, or chant a short homage to them. And just chant it over and over again, and imagine the central quality of that bodhisattva or Buddha being concentrated into the amulet. So, for example, if you like Guanyin, then you might hold the amulet, visualize Guanyin, think of her gentleness and compassion, chant Namo Dabe Guan Shi Yin Pusa, so homage to the great compassionate Guanyin Bodhisattva. And then just chant that over and over and over again while imagining that amulet becoming ever brighter and brighter with the warm, soothing, gentle compassion of Guanyin Bodhisattva. So this is a very safe way of charging an amulet, if that's something that you want to do. But yeah, the Google approach, not recommended. You'll find all sorts of stuff about how to invoke the spirit of Cthulhu and so on. That's really not recommended. So let's stick to, he's trying to soothe the cat. So let's stick with the Buddhist things. If you want to charge an amulet, do it the Buddhist way, using a bodhisattva or a Buddha. Okay.
Okay. Then Zeus says, Bante, you said to meditate. You said you've meditated in the forest before. Have you tried to meditate in a scary place like a cemetery or on the edge of a cliff, outside a tiger's cave, etc.? I know that may be too traditional.
Yeah, I've done
it. Zen answers.
Yep. Actually, cemeteries aren't very scary. Yeah. At least not in this country. Yeah, they're not scary. I actually like cemeteries. They're very peaceful.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to say, if you look on a magazine like Buddha Dharma or something, you often see pictures of people meditating on like a cliff face or something. And this is just because the reality of a really good meditation is so boring to capture in a photo.
Yeah,
it's just a person
stock images
in like the side room, like just. I mean, like. Yeah, there's this whole idea of like going to really exciting places, but the most exciting place you can go is into your own body.
That said, check out Hillside Hermitage. You can Google them. The monks there are quite tough. No comment. All right, Goshen Inc. says, I've been feeding a stray cat once a day and can see that it's quickly losing weight and ravaged by fleas. I'm considering taking it to the vet. Am I taking away its freedom by making it an indoor cat?
So I actually like the advice that Mark gave. Mark's advice is quite good. Definitely take it to the vet, see what you can do to help it get healthy. That's very compassionate. I would say, yeah, I would follow Mark's advice. Let it be an outdoor cat for a little while, but during that time, look after it and take care of it and feed it and so on, and see. If it starts to take a liking to you and wants to hang around, then you might introduce it to your indoors. And if it likes the indoors too, then maybe you've got a cat. But even if not, just looking after the stray cats in your neighborhood is a very compassionate thing to do.
And then Lucas asks, how can I lose the allure for sensual pleasure? Every time I feel motivated to detach myself from it, I end up craving more than before.
So we have 1 minute to answer this question.
Okay,
go.
I'm going to go because I'm the greed type. And so what they'll say is probably not helpful. Just kidding. A little bit.
That's true. I would just say something.
You want to talk about big, like, go to the source.
So detaching yourself is not going to work, as you've noticed, because you haven't actually understood why you should be letting go of something. At least that's what it sounds like you're saying. I found that in my experience, it's actually very useful. And actually, this is something that you said, to cultivate the drawbacks. So as greed types, we love to pay attention to the beautiful aspects of whatever it is, sights, sounds, touch, etc. But we ignore sort of like the drawback, the difficulty, the stress, the pain that's involved both in trying to get whatever it is we want and when we get it. It seems like the pleasure that we thought that we built up in our head that we would experience is not actually what happens. And then afterwards, it's sort of like this, it's like falling, it's free falling. It's like, now I'm like experiencing the down, the low. So if you keep remembering that and cultivating that sort of awareness, then it starts to lose its pull. But at the same time, before you get into those situations, you can just remember like, oh, actually, this is probably not going to be as good as I think it is. And it is difficult to lose the allure for sensual pleasures. And one thing that the Buddha did say, and I actually think it's very encouraging, even though it sounds pretty severe, is that it's not going to be possible to completely detach from sensual pleasure until you've cultivated a pleasure that has nothing to do with the senses. And that's the pleasure of meditation. So as you're cultivating this sort of disillusionment, this dispassion for sensual pleasures, at the same time, try to cultivate the pleasure and peace of meditation, of samadhi, of concentration. And then you'll be like, oh, actually, meditating is free, first of all. I don't have to go anywhere. I can just plop down and it's pretty nice. And I don't experience hangovers or regret afterwards. And once you do that, then the scale starts to tip in the direction of letting go, renunciation.
And I think Liz has the last question.
Okay, and Liz says, what do your Dhamma names mean? Good last question.
Okay.
Pamuto. Pa is an emphatic particle. Muto is like muti, it means freedom, and the O is the nominative case, so it's one who has or one who is. And so literally it means one who is set free or well liberated.
And then my name's Sumano. Bante Sadaso named me. So if I remember correctly, Sumano means one who has a joyful and wholesome mind.
Correct.
And I'm named after a previous Buddha.
Yep. And possibly a future Buddha. My name means Sudaso, which is from Suddha, which means pure, and Asa, which means aspiration. So there's two ways of explaining that. One is that it's somebody who has aspirations which are pure. So my goals and intentions are pure. And the other is that it's aspiring to be pure. So my aspiration is to be pure, to attain purity.
Right. And then we can give a Zen answer to John. How should I assess my readiness for solitary retreat? Just do it.
Oh, I was going to say you're not ready yet.
Just do it and you'll find out that you're not ready yet.
If you have to ask whether or not you're ready, you're not ready.
I would say it's going to be a challenge either way. So get what you can out of the experience.
Yes, Ayasoma will speak more when she comes off of retreat, so maybe you can learn from her experience. All right, well, thanks everyone for joining us tonight for Monk Chat. Next week, since we'll be on in-house retreat, we'll be live streaming the talks from the retreat. So you can check the live stream schedule on YouTube for all the different talks. And hopefully you can join us then. And if you're in West Orange tomorrow, you can check out some of the events we have planned and stop by if you have time. All right, so we can end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a good night.